Good afternoon and welcome to another monthly session with myself, Luan Wise, and my friend and colleague, Professor Laura Chamberlain.
Hello, everybody.
Today, this is another session in our mission to bridge that gap between academia and industry, with myself being working in industry as a marketing consultant, running my own business now for 11 years, working with a whole mixture of clients, but trying as hard as I can to keep one foot in the books and the texts to keep myself up to date, which is very much supported by you, Laura.
And I'm Professor Laura Chamberlain. I'm a professor in marketing at Warwick Business School, and I'm the academic side of the partnership. But as much as Luan tries to keep her feet in the books, I try to also keep my feet in industry. So we like to dabble in each other's worlds quite a lot, I think. So that's why we came together. We've known each other for quite a long time. We came together and decided to share our thoughts around marketing with these LinkedIn live sessions.
Yeah, and today we wanted to finally share what we've actually been properly working on together for, well, not that work isn't proper, but but we've actually been working on a research study now for nearly 3 years since we started talking about it, when we were sat having a cup of coffee in the Warwick Business School cafe and talking about what we were both up to. And I think I said something and you just opened your laptop and went, right, let's scope this out, Luan.
For anybody that knows me, that's a very Laura thing to do. Right, yeah. How do we do this?
Yes.
That's me opening my laptop, yeah.
And we start typing, which was, brilliant, unexpected, and was one of those kind of, pinch yourself moments when you're on the drive home going, okay, I'm going to be doing a research project, and what's this all going to be about? But we wanted to actually share this with everyone today of what we've been working on for 2.5 years. And yes, there will be an ask of people viewing this and watching this on a replay as well. But just to introduce the project, it's unsurprising if you know that my specialism is the world of social media, is about how businesses, particularly small businesses, SMEs under 250 employees in the UK, how are they using or not using social media? And that may sound really obvious and, a simple question, but once we start diving in, it's not, because we also wanted to make this really marketing focused and understand how marketers are using social media, how they're engaging with it, how they're strategically thinking about it, how they're implementing day to day, and specifically how it really fits into their roles as well.
Yeah, and I think from my point of view, this is very much an applied piece of research. So this is not something that's theory-led, academic-led per se, although it does have obvious academic contributions. But it's about testing assumptions that you see, Luan, in your consultancy work. And we have done a literature review in true academic style, but also looking at bridging academia and practice. So what are the academics saying, and what are we actually seeing that's happening, quote unquote, in the real world? And the project evolved over time, and we started off with a questionnaire. But in terms of our research methodology, that's expanded. And we did some qualitative work, so some interviews, and we've also got data from some training that you have run, Luan. And so we've got a really rich data set around what we see that's been happening so far. And it's really, as Luan said, focused in the UK, so people working in marketing. And it was important to get a variety of data, this rich data set, so that we could really sort of explore and drill down into some of these issues. Things that we know exist, know are happening, but really thinking about how we conceptualize them, how we measure them, and how we think about them so that we can give practical advice based on research findings moving forward. We're going to share with you today some of our initial findings and some of the things that we've been looking at in this regard.
And it's just, I just want, before we start sharing, just how valuable I found going through this process with you. Yes, it has been challenging. Yes, I have read a lot of academic papers, and that's, if you're mix mixing your world between, you know, client and consultancy work and reading blogs and writing, and then, you know, diving into an academic piece of work, it is very different, but challenging in a good way. You know, I am a learner, I like to keep learning, but I think it's also, for me, it's been about balancing what you read in blogs and other people's insights and case studies and stories in the press with that academic rigor behind it. And I know that when we put the questionnaire together, I could see how it was really strongly based on literature review and the questions we were asking them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's for me the foundations of a good study. And in many ways, this is where looking at marketing through that scientific lens that we as academic researchers do is so important, because it allows us to talk about our findings and the fact that we know they're from a rigorous data set, but also it means it's generalizable in many regards as well. So and it's been a pleasure also to get the practical view, because often when I work in solely academic teams, we are very good at the academic side of it, but maybe less adept at thinking about the application of what we're trying to achieve into industry. So I think it's a really nice partnership in that regard.
Yeah, it's an interesting mix, isn't it? Because we have quite big debates, often via email, rather than being able to talk face to face about a really specific topic with a but in the, you know, this doesn't work, or this terminology doesn't add up. So I would encourage anyone to, you know, to get involved in research if that is an opportunity. And how,
absolutely, yeah.
you know,
And sorry, I thought you were going to make another point then.
Yeah.
Absolutely, get involved with research, and not just, you know, with me. There's many academics across the country, some of whom might be on this today. Hi, if you are, fellow academics, who we all want to engage more with what's going on in practice, and I think we're always looking for opportunities to build these partnerships and find ways to engage the academic side and the industry side, and that can be through working with an academic directly. Many business schools have opportunities for dissertation projects. So at Warwick we have MSc dissertations, where we work with organisations, and a student will be working on a particular project, for example, or a research question. It could be something like developing a social media strategy, or it could be identifying a problem and wanting an academic solution to that problem, conducting a piece of research. So, you know, those are also opportunities to not just engage with academics, but also to engage with the next generation of marketers as well through that kind of work. And also, you know, if you don't know any academics per se, you know, this is about building the network. There are many of us, but we're also always looking for people who are willing to come and speak to students who are guest lecturing, and, you know, if there's not research doesn't feel like something that you want to get involved with, but you would like to explore a link with academia, that's another thing that we're always looking for, is how we can engage with practice in many different ways. And I've given some really general examples there. I'm sure colleagues from other universities will be able to give more specifics about what they're looking for and the kinds of things they do. But it's also a space that many colleagues are innovating in as well, in terms of moving beyond a traditional guest lecture or something like that. How can we engage practitioner colleagues? So lots of opportunities there. And also, just to my academic colleagues, I think there's also a really important conversation about how we do this and how we do this well. And actually, through the work we're doing with the Academy of Marketing, in my role as chair of the Education Committee, but also more generally through the Academy, and Luana and I are also working on something with regards to that, thinking about how we do this as marketing academics is also really important, and something where we all can work together as well in terms of our pedagogic practice. So there's lots around this that can happen.
Yeah, and that was an aside, but I would highly recommend it. I did a few guest lectures at Warwick and other institutions, and just the engagement with the students and the questions that they ask, just, you know, is inspiring, and yes, again, sometimes challenging. But I've also worked with one of your colleagues where we presented a client I work with a case study. It was their assignment, and then we did a Q&A session, and it's just brilliant to be able to bring it together. So it is obviously something I hugely advocate. But going back to our project, which is, it does go off in all of these directions as we do on other topics that we talk about. But one of the key points from this literature review, when we started working on it at the end of 2019, which does feel like a different world, and to a certain extent it is, which is why we're continuing the research. But part of it was comparing B2B with B2C's organisation and their use of social media. And the literature review said a lot about how B2B organisations were slower to adopt social media as part of their marketing toolkit. They perceived it perhaps be somewhat less useful in terms of relationships in comparison to B2C. So there is often this mindset of comparison, isn't there? And people that work in B2B going, all the case studies I read, the learning I did is very B2C focused, but we were trying to make sure that we cover both sides as such.
Yeah, and not ignoring B2B, really. I think it's very easy to have a B2C focus, particularly as well as because we are all consumers. So if you're a marketer, an academic, and student, at the end of the day, we're also all consumers. So it's very easy to put your consumer hat on and think about also from a consumer side of things. But B2B is, as you say, often ignored or not considered, and it is an area rich for innovation in this space. So it's definitely something we wanted to consider.
And it's really interesting from a social media use in B2B, because what I find when I'm talking to people and training organisations is that often people's personal use of social media really has the impact on how they think about it and use it at work as well. It's kind of, it comes from that position. And actually the literature review also showed that sometimes there's a lack of knowledge about the benefits of social media for work because people's experiences are very much about, I use Facebook for my friends, or I use Instagram for this, and finding it harder to translate it into being a business tool. How can this support us? Do I have the technical skills? Is this part of my job role? Is often something that comes up as
Absolutely.
well.
And I think as well, people see social media in that context as something to do with their personal life. And it's almost easy to forget in some ways that in a B2B context, it's still human to human. You're still dealing with human beings. The B2B acronym makes it feel almost dehumanized, but it's not. And that's where this idea of using social media platforms to make those connections and foster those relationships and networks really comes into its own.
Yeah. So we did our literature review and we discussed it, and we had several iterations of our questionnaire, and we were all set, weren't we, to go out with this questionnaire in March 2020.
We were ready to go.
We were ready to hit that button. And things happened, and actually I remember I was in the States and you were messaging me going, I think you might need to try and get home earlier, Luan, not just for the research, but things are happening, get yourself home. And I did, and the research was ready, and we, the timings of that obviously changed slightly, but we were in a position that actually, because of the timings, we could add in a question about COVID, because I think we were about 3 or 4 days into lockdown. So we were also not only benchmarking and looking at the literature review, but actually able to make it really timely and ask that question about, how are you adapting? What are you doing? And include that in the questionnaire, and also the quals interviews that I did. The survey was completed by just over, I think it was 238 marketers' responses. And then I did 10, get the terminology, semi-structured qualitative interviews on that as well. And because we had this lovely benchmark as such of March 2020 and have been looking at the data ever since, we're now going to repeat that questionnaire. So 2.5 years later, we have reviewed the data so far, looked at the survey, our knowledge. We've had many more hours in consultancy, in practice, to see what else we might need to add into this or investigate or dive into further. So at the end of this session, I will be sharing links and asking you, if you're a marketer based in the UK, to help us with our next stage of the research. So in 2020, if we can remember back, the initial data, there was a real mix, and some of it I think did confirm our assumptions, which is a good thing for us to be doing. 89%, I have got the number written down, said that social media is useful for business, and that there was also a strong 60+% around people that strongly agreed or agreed that their organisation did recognise how social media was beneficial. And I think it's important to just note that March, April 2020 of this was pre-COVID. It wasn't just about COVID is here, we're in lockdown, social media is useful. It was very early on. So it was a business as usual, not impacted by COVID response to that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It was the start of the transition and the change that everybody went through, I think, which put an interesting lens on things. In terms of results as well, building on this idea that social media was seen to be beneficial, and I should caveat that as well with why it's important to ask that question, because you can't actually assume that is what people do think, if that makes sense. You almost have to sort of reconfirm your assumptions with data, and that's also a useful benchmark through which to look at the other data as well. And we found some really interesting results around, whilst people agreed that social media is useful for business and organizations recognized how social media is beneficial, we actually had a surprising number of responses that told us that they didn't know how social media actually fits into the organization's business plan. And I think it was roughly about a third of respondents, give or take, said that they didn't know how social media would fit into a business plan, which gives an indication that whilst on one hand people are seeing it as important and we recognize this is something that we need to do ultimately, actually strategically, how is it fitting into what we're trying to do as an organization? And we asked some questions as well around the ideas around what investing in social media looks like, and then also perceptions around what it costs a business. And interestingly, so it was around 76% of people said that actually social media was a big investment. Now, investment in this context can involve obviously financial, but it's about time, effort as well. But a smaller number, so about 47%, said that actually the costs of this investment in social media outweighed the benefits. And that was also a very surprising situation to be in, because whilst people see it as an investment and hopefully a positive one, this idea that the cost of social media outweigh the benefits for nearly half of our respondents was quite surprising. And also about 38% of our respondents were neutral on that question as well. So what this starts to allow us to think about is the idea that it's not all roses, right? It's about this idea that people are apprehensive and nervous around what the negative side of social media is, because it seemed to cost more than it's bringing into an organization. And this, I think, Luan, speaks to one of the things that we very originally talked about in our conversation around this idea of cost benefit. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that a little bit in terms of what you see in industry from your point of view.
I think social media, it feels like it's well established, it is here, but at the same time it feels that it's still something relatively new for businesses to grasp, to incorporate, to get their marketing teams involved in. And I think we're still quite early in that evolution of where does social media fit in an organization, or who could do this, who could do some posts, versus there's some brilliant social media managers and officers and execs out there, but for some organizations to involve in that level of resource is a risk, is a challenge, it's an addition. So it is something new, and where it fits, I think, is often a challenge for organizations. And then of course, what resources do they need, and how do we do this, and how does it change what we've always done that hasn't been broken, but we're in this world. And as I said, because I think social media is something that people were doing in their personal lives and are doing in their personal lives, this almost like, oh, someone said we should be doing Facebook. Someone said we should be doing this. And, you know, my marketing career, we always get those questions, don't we? We should be doing this. And, you know, there is thought and reason behind why we decide to do what we do and what we don't do. But social media was one of those areas that I think, because it's easy to access on our phones, people are using it for friends and family, that it has become quite a big focus for organisations. But at the same time, this challenge of resources, investment, what do we do? And sometimes it feels quite chicken and egg. And, you know, there's a brilliant marketoonist cartoon that I use a lot that says, you know, what's the big idea? We're going on Facebook, we're going on this, we're going on that. Oh, but what are we going to do? And you wouldn't do that with any other marketing channel or approach. So I think it is still very misunderstood, and we've got a long way to go, which is kind of why we particularly want to dive back into that area, don't we, around resources and where the role fits in organisations.
Absolutely. And I think as well, it's important to say this is not true of every organisation.
No.
There are some people who do social media
No.
brilliantly.
Yeah.
And what we did when we collected the data as well, we asked for information about things like size of organisation. So with SMEs particularly, we found these effects to be really much more pronounced. So in SMEs, the cost of using social media was perceived to be more than the benefits of social media. Anecdotally, this also feeds into the idea that you kind of were alluding to there, Luan, that often I see a situation where social media is given to the intern.
Yes.
You know, they're young, give it to the intern, they'll know what to do. They post on social media all the time, and it's not embedded in the strategy for an organization. Again, not in every case, and there are, as you say, wonderful social media managers, and there are organizations who have social media embedded into their strategy, but they are sadly not yet the norm. And this is almost what our research is also reconfirming. And I think one thing that was also coming out of our results as well, because we looked at this strategic piece, but also this idea of what it is that helps people to embed social media into a strategy. And we found that there could be a misunderstanding between thinking strategically about social media and also the idea of the implementation, the tactics around social media. And those are actually not one and the same. And speaking to that strategic piece, we also asked how people measured their return on investment with social media, because that's a very important question that links this idea of costs and benefits, that often if you have to justify why you want a social media strategy, you need to show how your social media is having an impact. And not everybody that we surveyed was measuring ROI at all. And of people that did measure ROI, website traffic was the top measure of ROI, followed by number of followers, which is an interesting one. And again, this is something that I think we in future work want to unpick, because for me, followers is great, but that's not a measure of impact or conversion or anything like that. That's just how many people you've managed to get to follow you or like your page, which isn't necessarily about return on investment. But there were some people that measured, I think it was about 33% against business objectives, and 39% measured their ROI based on leads generated. And it's interesting because I would say not all measures of ROI are created equal. And so I think there's a wider piece there around what are people measuring, and then sort of coming towards eventually thinking about, well, what are the most meaningful ways to measure ROI? And I think in support of that, Luan, there was some work from the qualitative interviews that kind of supported what we were thinking about there.
Yeah, and I think that's the great part about doing the qual after the data of, we could look at what areas we needed to dive into. And from the interviews that I carried out, there is a challenge around presenting to the board. And I know that this isn't just a social media challenge either, but just this gap between sometimes what the board are requesting, and that likely is to be number of followers, because that is a metric that everyone understands, but also the board having a lack of understanding around social media. So that disconnect of, you know, what do they want to know, what do they need to know, and getting that balance right. But the quads did unveil that the board were interested around data, particularly in comparison to what are our competitors doing. So that's a whole different area to explore as to what are the business benefits. Is it around listening, seeing what the industry is up to, rather than perhaps always tying directly back to website traffic and lead gen as well?
Yeah, and there was a question we asked in the data set as well, which was kind of almost around motivations for use of social media, which links to that. And it was something around we're doing it because everybody else is doing it. That's the reason. reason. And again, a lot of our respondents, I think it was definitely over half of our respondents, sort of indicated that the part of the motivation and reason that they were doing social media, because not that it was an industry norm, it was because their competitors were using social media. And again, that's another area of disconnect. We're doing it because everybody else is doing it. We feel like we have to do it, but do we really know what we're doing? Have we thought about it strategically? And I think it also starts to build this picture of where these disconnects are starting to appear, really.
Yeah, and that's a topic that's kind of top level social media as the channel, but also we are still seeing that, you know, experience wise around when a new platform is introduced. And I do know that there was a question in this survey, and she's laughing already, because it was around what platforms do you use for different purposes. And remember, this was at the end of 2019 when we were
she's getting a defense in early
talking about the results and, you know, what might we expect to make sure that we were testing the right things. And yeah, I did, you know, hands up, I said I don't think TikTok for Business is going to come out strongly in this.
This is one of those debates that we have, and I said I think we should include it. And Luan said not, and I said yes, and I put my foot down, and I I got the upper hand in that argument, and we did include TikTok into our research study, and it has caused a lot of amusement between us since, because as we all know, during the pandemic, I think even much to TikTok's surprise, if we're honest, TikTok really took off. And I think what we're seeing now, which is why it's really interesting to redo the study 2.5 years later, is actually how this is now being used by organizations in business. Of course, in the beginning and during much of the pandemic, it was a social media platform that was purely for entertainment, and people spent a lot of time in lockdown creating wonderful TikTok videos. And you know, that caused a lot of entertainment, but you know, people really are engaging with it in many different ways now, and really starting to think about the full benefits of that as a platform. And interestingly, other platforms are taking on features that simulate what TikTok do. Just as an aside, outside of the research, I was talking to somebody about the other day about people starting to do TikTok CVs, which I thought was a really interesting, really interesting idea. But yeah, so it has caused a lot of amusement between the two of us, and we did include TikTok in our research. But actually, I just want to circle back round, because that conversation was something that was really interesting, because we open with each other, and we laugh about things, and we learn from things that happen. But I think nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody can see what's going to happen. And there are going to be other platforms that come in. And it's about how do we understand platforms and how we embrace new platforms as they come in, and how they can be used in business. But actually, and I'm not saying this is what happened with you, Luan, at all, but actually when people look at different platforms, particularly ones that are new, if they're ones that you have no experience of, there's a fear around that as well. So, you know, if you've never posted on TikTok or Snapchat, for example, then there is a sort of innate fear around, I don't know what to do on that platform. It feels, you know, different. And I think when we looked at our research, we also included the collection of information about what people were scared of to do with platforms. And one of the key ones that came out around that fear element was the fear of getting trolled.
Yeah.
And I think that's also something we need to be really cognizant of and really think about moving forward, is not just how we overcome that fear with individuals who are tasked with posting on social media, but also how organizations have a strategy around this, because it is an inhibitor of people moving their social media presence and strategy on.
Yeah, and we're not we're aware that this does happen. We're human beings as well, and we read about it, and we know that there's others that haven't had experiences of it. So it was an important question for us to explore. And actually I did a couple of quals specifically around trolling as well, to pull out into the next steps of the research. But there was also a fear and a question that we asked then around people didn't want to give away their USPs, their commercially sensitive information, to competitors. So that need to kind of hold back and consider what it is that we're sharing on this marketing channel that is consumed by millions and millions of people. So I think there's a recognition of fears and understanding, and some of those we can reassure and give tactics to set up privacy settings and know what you're sharing and with who, and considerations, and in an organizational point of view, having that social media policy that is robust and considered by not just HR, but by marketing, by legal, and around do's and don'ts, so that it's not saying the fear doesn't exist, but it's also actually saying these are the benefits, and we're empowering you and supporting you and being prepared for it as well.
Absolutely.
So yeah, there's a lot in this research, isn't there?
There's an awful lot. We're only just scratching the surface.
Yeah.
And to that point, I'm conscious of time.
Yes.
As always, we're going on.
And
I think just to pick up on the pandemic issue here, when we did ask questions about what was happening at the beginning of the pandemic, and our findings were really showing that even at that early stage in the pandemic, 60% of our respondents changed the way that they were using social media at that snapshot point in time. So it'll be really interesting to find out now, 2.5 years later, what's going on. So we have the unique benchmark from the start of the first lockdown, and we're going to look at what's changed. And you wrote a paper on this.
I did at the time. So in August 2020, I did a summary of what were the impacts so far, just from the quals, and also how the platforms had changed and what support they were providing as well. So I will pop that in a link under this session as well. And yes, we do joke about it, but I am really pleased that we included the TikTok question, and I can't wait to see how the data has shifted and to dive into that. So it does feel that as much as our research plans had to change at that time, as it did for many, many other people, actually it was a perfect timing to get some data. And now 2.5 years later, which, COVID isn't the only thing that's happened in 2.5 years, and there is other events in the context of what we're doing. So we know that we can't isolate COVID as the benchmark, but we know that from what we've seen already and what we discuss regularly and keep referring back to, we did a question on this, and what does this mean? That this next stage of research that we are going to ask you to get involved with, I will be adding the links all over our profiles in the next few days and things like that, to get involved with the questionnaire with us. And if anyone is available for a 15-minute call interview in early November, I'd love to spend some time talking and diving into these subjects anonymously. When we collate the research, it is all anonymous, isn't it?
But ultimately we're really looking for this perception of what the benefits are of social media, and where we think these perhaps disconnects or concerns are happening around using it in the business context, or even examples of where it's being used really, really well to sort of benchmark excellent use of social media in this context. We know the world's different now, and it's changed since we first started talking about it in 2019. So we want to continue doing this, and with the findings, we're going to share our findings. We're going to disseminate them. We're going to talk about them in academic circles, in practitioner circles. We'll talk about them here in our LinkedIn live sessions. And it's also going to feed into your book, Luan. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So if you're not aware, I did write a book called Relax, It's Only Social Media, published at the end of 2016. And it has been I don't know how many times have I said to you, Laura, I'm writing the second version, I'm writing the second version, did get put on hold around lockdown years, but now the second version is as complete as it can be, with insert responses to question 33 and 39 cross tab here. So that's almost ready, but it's, and then I will rewrite around it depending on what the results are. But it just means that the next version of the book is not only my experience and advice and learnings, but it has, as I said at the beginning, got that academic rigor to support it as well. So I'm very excited about how that moves forward. It's getting there. And what we're not trying to do is be definitive about our answers. We know that, while it's, we're asking 200 plus marketers to get involved, and the quals that is still a relatively small number, but it is data, it is robust, and it's, for us, it's about starting conversations and actually opening up the conversations that you and I regularly have to get more inputs from both academics and industry practitioners. So we are inviting colleagues to join us on future LinkedIn Lives. The data won't be ready for next month, but next month we are going to be joined by Fran Hyde, who's a senior lecturer in marketing at the University of Suffolk, who I met at the Academy of Marketing conference back in the summer, and is also doing work around this bridging the gap and how we can get industry practitioners involved in teaching and exploring ways of that. And we have other colleagues from both industry and academia joining us over future months as well. So we're planned, and it's all
yes,
very
we're going to be inviting guests to join us, so it's not just Luan and I talking moving forward. But hopefully we've given you an overview of our research and what we've been up to behind the scenes. I know Luan's going to post all the links, but we'd love you to get involved in whatever capacity, whether it's answering the questionnaire, whether it's being through the qualitative interviews, or indeed sharing your insights and thoughts with us. There's lots of opportunities to get involved and build this as a stream of research. We're doing one piece, but there's always more that can be done as well.
Yeah, that flew by again, so we will wrap it up for today. And please join us next month, which will be the 16th of November.
Fantastic. Great to see everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.